Thank you. Thank you, Charles, and a warm welcome from me as well. I'm also a member of the UK Values Alliance. And as Charles said, today's session is being facilitated by me, by Charles Fallot, who many of you know, and also Alan Williams, who's very well known in the UK, the values community. What I was going to say, and I think from the outset, is that today's review discussion is, as you would expect from the UK Values Alliance, it is through the values lens. It's not about apportioning what was right and what was wrong. It's not about apportioning blame of who did what when, and it's not about personalities, which can be quite difficult, but the whole subject of the Post Office events have received such intensive media scrutiny. But it is, as you would expect from the UK Values Alliance, about values where they were challenged, where they were abandoned, and critically, where they could have made a difference. And I'm excited about the conversation because this really hasn't been discussed, as far as I know, at length at all. And of course, the facts, as Charles said, are still emerging in this case. The inquiry is ongoing. Just before I pass over to Charles, I was just going to go through the format of today. In a moment, Charles is going to look at some of the known facts about what happened. And then after that, we're going to go into 3 breakout groups. Each breakout group will represent a different stakeholder and will be the subject of a values-based discussion. Coming back from that first breakout group, where they're going to have a sort of joint feedback session, and then go into the final discussion, where really the point of that is to try to draw out examples of, for instance, what you might have done personally had you found yourselves in the shoes of the different stakeholders in this situation. So that's basically the format. And I'd now like to pass over to Charles to look at some of the established facts. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. So I think just bear with us if you've been following the details of this scandal as it's been emerging over the years, and particularly the inquiry currently going on. Some of you, I know certainly my colleagues, have looked at the television program, the television series Mr. Bates Against the Post Office, in which case you'll be very well clued up. But even that was a few months ago. So what we're going to do is rehearse the facts very briefly in a few minutes, just to remind ourselves what actually happened, because I would guess that for all of us, some of the facts probably escaped us at the time. And so it's both just, we'll have a quick review and start at the beginning, and just, this is what happened basically. In 2000, the Post Office, as you'll recall, introduced new software, which was developed by Fujiitsu, called Horizon, and was rolled out across its whole network of branches right across the country. As we now know, the software had serious faults, which actually meant that some sub-postmasters accounts showed false shortfalls. This was absolute key to the whole thing. The Post Office then obliged the sub-postmasters under the terms of their contract to repay these false shortfalls, and many were prosecuted and wrongly convicted of offences such as theft, fraud, false accounting, and so on. Some sub-postmasters were suspended or dismissed. In all, over 900 to date were prosecuted for dishonesty, offences of one kind or another. Some were convicted or imprisoned. Some made bankrupt, some lost their homes. Many of them suffered mental or physical health problems and marriage problems, family breakdowns. One postmaster sadly stepped in front of a bus after being chased by the Post Office for £100,000. And there were other suicides which were related to what happened. To bring all of this to life, I just run through quickly the story of one of the early victims. It was one called Tracy Felsted, And this is the account of what happened to her as told by her barrister, Paul Marshall, who's been quite active in this whole investigation. In 2001, Tracy was a recent school leaver, proud to have secured employment at a post office branch. In a short while, Horizon recorded a shortfall of 11,500 at the till she was working on. She protested her innocence, but was prosecuted by the post office. There was, like all the others, no evidence that she'd ever physically taken any money, just the computer record. The post office and Fujiitsu were requested to provide electronic evidence which might help her case, but they refused on the basis of cost, and that evidence was never produced, and she was convicted of theft. This is in 2002. She was 19 years old. She refused to apologize when invited to do so by the trial judge, saying she had done nothing wrong, and she was immediately locked up in a young offenders institution. In 2020, she received compensation of £17,000, most of which went to pay lawyers' fees, and a bit later her conviction was quashed. The court finding that the post office had denied her a fair trial in not providing the electronic evidence. One can imagine the impact of 20 years of having to declare convictions whenever you try to apply for a job and so on, and you know, half a life spent in this nightmare. Right from the beginning of the Horizon rollout, there were numerous complaints by postmasters that the system was producing erroneous data, but all the time the post office completely denied it. They falsely told each complainer that nobody else was experiencing the problems. From 2007, some of the challenges started reaching the court in test cases, and we now know that the knowledge of computer bugs on the system was hidden from the judges and jurors by the post office and those working with them, so sub-postmasters continued to be convicted. We know that the post office knew about the bugs in the Horizon system from very early on, probably from the first few years. Certainly in 2010, we now know that there was a meeting with a number of senior employees of Fujiitsu and the post office, at which a bug called receipts and payments mismatch bug was discussed. This bug, it was acknowledged, would cause postmasters' receipts and payments to appear to balance at the terminal, at the branch terminal, but not do so at the post office's main servers. In short, an error by the system wouldn't be apparent to the branch, to the sub-postmaster, but would be apparent to post office head office. It was recorded in writing after this meeting that this might present a problem for the post office in its ongoing, quote, ongoing legal cases. A senior Fujitsu computer engineer who was present at the meeting actually gave evidence just a few weeks later at a postmaster's trial and said nothing about it. The post office, as you'll probably know, did eventually initiate formal investigations internally, but it didn't really look as though they wanted to uncover the truth. Second Sight, a firm of reputable forensic accountants, were hired in 2012, but in as early as July 2013, it seems that the Post Office Board wanted to sack, I'm quoting from the evidence, wanted to sack Second Sight and weren't coping well with the fact that they were independent. The following year, a decision was made to basically bring the investigation back inside the post office, in other words, sideline Second Sight. Second Sight had filed an initial report about the same time, probably why they were brought, sidelined. The post office was worried that its contents could be damaging and took advice at that time, we now know, on whether the company could block it with an injunction. And at that time, again, the post office's most senior lawyer at the time later claimed that she was forced out of the business of trying to uphold the independence of their investigation against Second Sight's investigation against executive pressure. And she suffered a mental breakdown. She said, "It was clear I just couldn't continue in my role. I'd never experienced a situation where my integrity as a lawyer was in conflict with the interests of the business." Other reports, internal reports, simply never saw the light of day. There was one in 2013, again, from known as the Clark Advice, from an independent barrister that found that an IT expert had misled juries in several trials. But this report was again squashed and only became public in 2021, well after the whole stuff had exploded, after the High Court claim brought by Mr. Bates and others. In public, the Post Office continually claimed that Fujiitsu's IT staff could not remotely alter branch accounts without the branch manager's knowledge. They did this even after a Fujiitsu whistleblower had come forward and contradicted those claims. In 2015, written evidence to a select committee inquiry. In that evidence, the Post Office still falsely claimed there's no functionality in Horizon for either branch, Post Office or Fujiitsu to edit, manipulate, remove transactional data and so on, once it's been recorded in the branch's accounts. They only actually admitted that it was possible after the High Court case in 2019. We can get an idea of attitudes inside the Post Office leadership from a remark in a memo that's come out from a senior employee to the CEO in 2014. And he said, it was a he, "We cannot accommodate the self-indulgence of a number of allegations of malcontents to the continuing detriment of our customers. The tiny minority making allegations, while deserving of respect and due process, cannot be allowed to pollute our public service mission." What do you make of that? During all this time, the Post Office conducted a legal and PR campaign to denigrate the complainants and whistleblowers. After 17 years of this blocking and denial and misleading, finally, Alan Bates, Mr. Bates, and his group of 555 people took on the Post Office and took them to the High Court. They arrived there in March 17. We've all seen a lot of us have seen the movie now on TV. It all culminated in two major judgments, which were extremely critical of the Post Office's software, also its contracts with the postmasters, which were very oppressive and narrow, and its general behaviour. The Court of Appeal overturned convictions of initially 39 postmasters. Since then, there's been more overturned, taking the total to 102. The statutory inquiry began in 2022, as we know, with Sir Win Williams, former High Court judge, still continuing. And it is fair to say, this is the final bit, it's only fair to say that the Post Office now has acknowledged its wrongdoing. We looked on the website the other day and found a quote taken, and this is taken from the PO website directly yesterday. It says, "The Horizon IT scandal involves events which took place over many years concerning the reliability of Post Office computer system Horizon, issues related to contracts with postmasters and the culture of the Post Office at the time. Many postmasters were wrongly held responsible for losses in their branch accounts that they could not explain, with some losing their livelihoods. There were also wrongful prosecutions and convictions for theft, fraud, and false accounting based on unreliable Horizon data. We are sincerely sorry for the devastating impact on so many lives, and the priority of today's Post Office is to ensure that victims receive justice and financial redress as swiftly as possible." So that's it, really. I hope that reminds you a little bit about what's happened. If it sounded a bit one-sided, I can only say I try to make it as objective as possible, but you can't help having a little emotion creeping in there. And so that's the facts of the case. So I'm going to hand over now to Alan to take us explain what we're doing next. Alan, over to you. You're muted.
Yeah, let me take myself off mute. So like Charles said at the beginning, we're now going to break out into three groups, and Charles is just sorting that out right now. And the three groups that we would like you to focus on are the following: the Post Office leadership team, Fujiitsu leadership team, and the Sub-postmasters. So we're going to be in a group, one group of three, dealing with each of those stakeholder groups. And the question is very similar for each group. And it's this: what key three values drove the response of the stakeholder group as the situation developed? So what we're asking you to do is to identify three values that you think are in play strongest for the stakeholder group discussion that you're having. And when we come back, we'd like to hear one person from each of the groups to just explain just in a couple of minutes, the general sense of their discussion, and then to identify the 3 values that you've come to the conclusion are strongest at play. So are there any questions about what we're going to be doing in these breakout groups, or is that clear?
Can I just say, we just had somebody join us, so I think I'm going to have to recreate, unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, but just take a moment, the breakout room. So can I do that again? And Javier has just joined us, so let me just see if he's got picked up by this. So we're going to recreate.
So Javier, while we're waiting, if you didn't catch it, we're breaking out now into 3 groups, and each group will take one of 3 stakeholder groups, the post office leadership, Fujiitsu leadership, and the sub-postmasters. And the question that you will ask in your group is, what key 3 values drove the response of that particular stakeholder group? And when you come back, please identify one person from the group, which won't be Neil, Charles, or myself, to just give us a general sense of the discussion, and then the 3 values identified. And do keep that brief, please. We're not inviting you to share the detail of the conversation. It's just give us a feel of the flow of it.
Perfect.
Just a few minutes to do that. And what we're really wanting to capture is the 3 values that you've identified as in play.
Something different, but that's why things went wrong, because they were being driven.
It should be us.
Hi, Ruth. How are you?
This is really annoying. It keeps booting me out of gallery view. There we are.
That was a way to end the rant.
Yeah, I apologise. I do apologise.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had good fun and not easy conversations. It sounds like it's about right. Ruth, I know, is going to share the feedback from the first group. So, Ruth, just a few minutes, please. So, firstly, a general sense of the discussion, and then the 3 values that have been identified.
Okay, we had a wide range. Just put your hand up when you want me to stop if I haven't. We had a wide-ranging discussion around a variety of different motivating factors, beginning in a way, I suppose, with a conversation around loyalty, wanting to protect the brand, people groupthink, and a sort of systemic defect in that people wanted to feel they belonged, and so they didn't want to rock the boat. They were afraid of perhaps whistleblowing, and inability. So fear, obviously, hugely fear-driven environment. People's behavior attributable to fear in a variety of ways, possibly some bullying, etc. We also talked about a desire for achievement and some greed and avarice that may have come into it, not wanting to lose bonuses, jobs, salaries, etc. Possibly also a sense of arrogance, given what the organization was, and we must be right. And I have a sense, personally, I believe there might have been some racism underneath there. But there was definitely a sort of motivated blindness. It was in their best interest not to see what was going on for a variety of reasons, so they didn't. And then at a certain point, they would have had to, if they had admitted that they'd been wrong, they would have had to admit it a lot, that they lied and acted against evidence, etc. So fear would come in a different way, because they might have feared prosecution and criminal, etc. So 3 values, I would say, cluster around loyalty, driven by a variety of things, wanting to belong, etc. A cluster around achievement, so all of the reasons why they would have been motivated to be blind and have developed tunnel vision and groupthink would have helped that to happen. And then a sort of arrogance, complacency thrown in to the mix, all of which was incredibly toxic and made them defensive and basically, terrible. Right. Is that quick enough?
That was perfectly quick, Ruth. Thank you so much. And just give the other guys in the room a chance to add anything if Ruth's missed anything out. But that was a really great job. Anybody want to mention anything quickly before we move on to Fujiitsu group? Take that as a no. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so this is Javier. Just briefly, in the context of arrogance, there might be a sense that you can get lost in the vast volume of people in an organization that big. So there's a lot of hiding places in places where there's so many people and matrix organizations and dotted lines and reported lines. So it's kind of easy to hide as well.
Okay.
These were the leaders, Javier. These were the leaders, so they should, they're not hiding. Anyway, yes.
Okay, so let's move on to the second group. So Fujiitsu, Charles, who's
we actually, I cut myself off. I cut us off before we got round to that bit. But Juliet, would you like to? Because
I think I was busy being nominated, probably because I spoke the most. Apologies, or the most forcefully.
Juliet has personal experience with Fujitsu. Anyway, over to you.
Some of it was because I have been puzzled by Fujitsu's role, but partly because I did work in or with the organisation for about 10 years, in about 2000 to 2010. So I could, a bit of guessology going on. The end point which I was pushing for, and I think we might have got to agreement, but about the values, but then I'll say a little bit about how we got there, or the other things we talked about were, and there'll be a big mirror here with the post office, reputation, technical credibility, because for Fujitsu that is so critical, being the technicians at whatever level you are, and I'm afraid hard-nosed profit. Behind that, in terms of the sort of the culture of the organisation, which we're talking about, we talked about the fact that Fujitsu, certainly working in this country on a government contracts, would be quite bureaucratic. And even with their Japanese owners, they'd probably be quite bureaucratic as well. So, problems would be sort of maybe down there. We did use the word groupthink quite a lot because we thought that probably they entered into a kind of groupthink with the post office for kind of mutual support, and they might dress that up as sort of customer satisfaction, but it becomes a group think. An interesting point about the fact a lot of the technical people further down would be contractors and not really part of either organisation, and that there was probably just a lack of being joined up. So it's possible even at high levels that the Fujitsu leadership wouldn't know a lot of what was going on, as not to take away their sense of responsibility, but it would have all been buried a bit as a kind of out there contract, and there's lots of lack of transparency. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Simon?
I was just saying as well about the fact that how their stance now for having using this report, using the information, saying it solely, didn't realise that the information from the expert witnesses was to be solely for prosecution. And I just think that has I don't know, it's backward thinking, but it brings a different view to it. It highlights something now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think just to add something to that, Maggie, the phrase that came into my mind, I didn't speak it because I thought we'd be careful using it, but willful blindness. And I think that's what I thought when I first read the statement of the Fujitsu CEO. Actually, it was very carefully phrased, as you pointed out, Maggie, to probably be unimpeachable in truthfulness, but it revealed blindness to me, and I think the Fujitsu leadership possibly may have been guilty of this. We have to be a little bit careful what we're saying, because we don't want to accuse people. But it looks as though organisationally they were willfully blind. Thank you, Ruth.
I wouldn't be any problem accusing them of being willfully blind.
No.
First of all, this conversation has no judicial and secondly, it's blindingly obvious that they were willfully blind.
So just as a point of confirmation or clarification, Juliet, the 3 values words, I think you said reputation.
Reputation, technical credibility, and profit.
Okay, thank you very much. And group 3, so here we have the Sub-postmasters and Neil, and if you could follow Ruth's lead of like a very concise 3 minutes, that would be great.
We didn't actually nominate, but Emma, I think you made some great notes.
I was scribbling. It's always a giveaway, isn't it? So we obviously had looked at a lot of the emotional side of this, but we quite quickly came up with 3 values, and we started at that beginning bit. What would the values be when this system arrived and it was showing up problems which you knew you weren't guilty of? And we thought they had a very high trust integrity, like that for them that would be an important value, that they had a belief in justice, that there was a sort of the system will work, it'll work itself out. And we think there was fierce loyalty probably at play in all of them. I'm working for the post office or working for these public sector organizations. People do it for a passion, and it's also driven about being part of the community. So, it's not just about the money and the job. They are very involved in everything that goes on around them. And we were then talking about how those values might have changed or evolved throughout the process. And each time we kind of thought about a time, we felt actually the values probably didn't evolve. What happened is that you probably had a huge conflict when you couldn't live your values. So, for example, if you had to plead guilty, not to go to jail or whatever, or to do a compromise or pay some money that you knew you did not owe, that conflict with your value of justice and integrity and doing the right thing would create emotional situation that we don't even like to think about, how difficult and how hard that would be. So, and that maybe loyalty will have shifted from the post office but to the legal system or to their support groups, but that loyalty kept running through all the stages of this process. And we described stoicism. I don't know whether stoicism is a way you hold on to your values deliberately, but we discussed how stoical they would all need to be. So I think we came up with the fact that their values probably didn't change. It was the emotions around it. Then, as we were just kind of finishing, Dorian was suggesting it would be interesting to look back on what they might feel their values are in the years to come, and talking about how actually their values may well drive them to insist on a fundamental review of our legal system, how the lawyers operate, how the culture in the court, all of this stuff. How did this happen in our society where we have a belief? And we were also talking about, why did society not wake up to this until there was a drama, an ITV drama? Yeah. So that says something about society as well, doesn't it? That we're not engaging until it's given to us in a way we can hear it. So I think, did I cover it? Team, anybody, anything else to add?
That's Emma, that's absolutely great. Brilliant.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, Emma? Hi, Emma. Can I ask you a question? Do you think that, or did the team discuss at all the idea that the type of people who are postmasters would have felt relatively powerless? I mean, if these people had been franchise holders from a middle or upper class background, they would have immediately lawyered up and fought the post office. Whereas in the beginning, a lot of these people just accepted that they had to be wrong because, well,
I think, the team can't, but I think it wasn't that they accepted. I think when they accepted they're wrong, that's when they had that problem with their values. That became difficult. But I just felt I'm sure their loyalty to the system, the justice system, it will work out. That's kind of where I think we were. Any other thoughts?
No, I think Emma, you're right. I think you don't take on being a sub-postmaster to become a millionaire. You take on it to expand your services and to service the community. And your analogy about public sector workers is probably right. And that word that you were talking about, stoicism, I think really does, for me, hit the nail on.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the sessions. And
Alan, can
I think so.
Simon just wants to say a word. Can we let him?
Yeah, I suppose I was just we've had a similar sort of scandal in Australia with the payment of it's called robo-debt, payment of benefits, and there I think the issue has been a bit along the lines Ruth was saying, with a potentially racism or cultural thing, that the people who are making all the decisions come from a different strata of society than the people who are being impacted. And while the post office, from what I've been observed of it, the post office, sub-post officers were very loyal and trustworthy and all that sort of thing, I don't think that the powers that be in the head office necessarily had the same view of them. And so they were open to, so when it became apparent that there were lots of people who allegedly had stole money, they were quite happy to believe that. Whereas the post office people thought of themselves as very honest, hardworking people, I just can't believe how the senior people suddenly got this rash of prosecutions for fraud. I didn't think, what's going on? Why is this suddenly emerged? I think there is a hierarchical cultural challenge, and we saw that certainly in the robo-debt, and I suspect that's one of the factors in the values issues for the post office issue.
Yeah, it fed into their biases and stereotypes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that's as well. Sub-post masters are individuals. They're not part of that organisation in the same way. They are an extension of it because they are providing the service, if that makes sense. They are, they're their own business, and so that's each one's individually. They're not a group. Yeah. And so they haven't got much power until they got together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They were like disparate employees, and I think they were easy to be. It was easy to kind of sideline them. But
Exactly.
But the one thing that I think that probably started it all off, and something I explained to the group, in my opinion, is the history prior to Horizon being installed, which was huge loss-making. PO was loss-making. And I think this is where Fujitsu and PO probably started to collude in such a way that they say, oh, Fujitsu said, yes, we can find the problems. And PO said, right, the profit, will be coming back. And therefore, there was a lot of kind of collusion and groupthink.
Again, it rather underlines that you're underlining the same point, really. There's a suspicion on one side, but probably not on the other. Alan, I've inadvertently pushed us a little bit behind our timing. So do you want to?
Yeah, that's okay. We can catch up. So for the final part of the session, we've got 3 questions that we're going to deal with. Think of this as much as a time for you to reflect about the question as it is for you to contribute, because we're not going to have so much time. We're going to have about 7 minutes for each question. So the first one is, faced with evidence that made you feel uncomfortable and clearly breaching your personal values, what action would you take? And this is in a general context now, so don't think about the post office specifically. Think more generally, more widely. And like I say, if you don't want to say something, that's fine. You can just reflect on it. But please feel free to share your immediate response to that question. So just one more time. Faced with evidence that made you feel uncomfortable and clearly breaching your personal values, what action would you take?
And that's in the context of an organization, I guess, isn't it, Alan?
Yeah.
I think for me, I would consider, who are the people that I can go to? Are they approachable? Or is there a mechanism in which I can go and speak to someone, consult or confide in someone? So that would be my view. And then I would also consider what are the repercussions on me if I go to the wrong person.
Okay.
I think how I'd answer that is probably how a Total Chair would. I think I would ask more questions than I'd go see. And as Japanese companies do refer to, is go to the Gemba. Go to where he's at. Go see for yourself. So that's generally what I would do. So I'd first go get more information. I'd be prompted to look because evidence was being presented to me on what didn't sound right. But, I'd just go see. Go to the front line myself. Go see what's actually going on. Go to the Gemba, how they call it in Japan.
I think for me, and if we're thinking of this in an organisation context, it really comes back to the nature of the organisation I'm working for. And this is where you end up with that kind of values clash, isn't it? Because if it says with my personal values, but if I was working for an organisation that I felt would support me in speaking out and saying, hey, look here, this is actually a clash with our culture, I'd be able to say something. But if I was working in an organisation that I didn't feel that, it would probably ultimately be a nail in the coffin and helping me on my exit route, because there comes a point that you just can't work in that sort of organisation. But I think that comes down to how strong your own personal values are threatened, and the extent to which you feel supported or unsupported, for me.
I think it also depends on the type of organisation you're dealing with. And one of the things that Alan Bates said when he gave evidence was about the fact that the post office had presented to the sub-postmasters that they were working in a partnership. And he said it became very evident very quickly that that was not the case. So this is an interesting question. If, as an individual, you're putting yourself in the shoes of a sub-postmaster, because you were asking the questions and protesting your innocence in this issue, but you were simply not being listened to. Now, I don't know whether, as an employee of the post office or Fujiitsu, you would have met that same culture as a direct employee. But it's fairly evident that I would say that listening was not a core skill of certainly the organizations involved here. So that suggests more radical action similar to a whistleblower might be your only course. And that takes a lot of courage and bravery to do.
And Juliet, just to add something else to what you were saying as well, is that I think there's a certain dependence on your personal circumstances as well, right?
Indeed, absolutely.
You might be in a situation, a privileged situation, where you can afford to walk away, for instance, if you're that affronted. But other people are not in such a situation, and it might be that you're unable to get a job somewhere else, or feel that you're unable to get a job somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem in designing integrity systems inside organizations. I mean, one of the things that you have to do is you have to provide a way for people to be able to speak up without suffering consequences, and that's very difficult to do. But I think, in answering the general question, I mean, as a in-house lawyer, I actually faced this situation several times, I would say. And what I chose to do, and I have to say, sometimes I didn't do it very effectively because I spoke out. Perhaps I didn't use strategies which would have made speaking out more effective, but I chose not to go along with what was happening if I thought it was wrong. And so I would go to the CEO or whoever, and it was very clear in my particular situation and the situation of any in-house lawyer that if you go to the CEO and they do nothing, you then have to go to the board. And if you go to the board and they do nothing, you have to resign. And in the US, which luckily I'm not practicing in and haven't for many decades, you would actually have to make a loud resignation. So you'd have to say why you resign publicly. Anyway, but I think the point is that if you're going to take that step and you're going to speak out, you need to be able to do it in a way that is less likely to damage your career. And one of the ways of doing that is to seek allies so that you're not the only one. And of course, as David said, make sure you get all your facts straight and that you could see this from various make it so they cannot deny it. But it does take courage, and it's not an easy thing to do. And there's something about tact and diplomacy that might help too.
Does this sort of story highlight the value of unions as an intermediary to help? Because it was, in this case, the postmasters, the union essentially for them was pretty useless because they were conflicted. But in another business environment, having a different channel to go through can be a way. I know in workplace health and safety, the unions can play a pretty critical role in supporting workers who identify improper action. So, the weakening of unions might make this sort of addressing this sort of issue more challenging.
Okay,
good point.
Looking
can I move sorry, Brad, but just to keep to time, I'd like to move on to the next question now. So this one, and again, please, can I remind you that we're no longer thinking just about the post office. So think in the broadest sense, in an organisational context. And the question is this: what kind of pressures within organisations do you consider contribute to this notion of willful blindness that we've talked about, of unwelcome facts and failure to uphold personal and/or organisational values? So what kind of pressures within organisations do you consider contribute to willful blindness of unwelcome facts and failure to uphold personal and/or organisational values?
Quarterly reporting for listed companies and incentives that are badly designed.
I think in the post office case, there was kind of an unusual phenomenon of sort of institutional loyalty between the different organizations.
I think that's a very interesting point, John, because that's a point that came up in our breakout group too. The loyalty is, and in our conversations generally, loyalty is a very powerful force, isn't it, really? Yeah. And it's value, but it's a very powerful value and sets of behaviors. And the loyalty to the group, loyalty to your immediate group, loyalty to the leadership group, all these loyalties are quite difficult to deal with in this context, aren't they? Because we see someone who's rocking the boat, and our instinct very often is to think, oh, why they're out of line. They shouldn't be doing this. Well, they're not thinking of the well-being, the reputation of the group, of the company, of the organization, of all of us.
So you're saying pressure to conform is that what you're saying?
Is that what I'm saying?
It's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Sorry. It wasn't what I was saying. I was saying it was a very unusual. You've got those different loyalties in each individual institution, perhaps, but there was a very unusual thing that all those loyalties seem to come together as an institutional loyalty. But it wasn't each organization didn't seem to want to turn and point the finger at the other very readily, which you would see in other cases. They all kind of melded into trying to push the same lie.
So what was the pressure that was making them do that?
I don't know the answer. That's what I'm saying. It's just a very unusual form of institutional loyalty. These people didn't know each other, but they all seem to have the same common mindset and the same mission or motive to achieve the same goal.
Is there something here about because I think what we're saying here is that the postmasters are kind of on the bottom rung of the ladder, right?
Yeah.
In terms of power. And so if there is a vacuum of real values, then what happens is the power dominates. Is that a potential assessment of this?
Well, I think that's it's a contention, Alan. I mean, I think when we were looking at the sub-postmasters, for example, we were also saying that they had loyalty to their communities and to the post office, at least initially. I think what you've got to understand, the willful blindness, which is where you know something is wrong, but you choose to ignore it, is endemic to the human condition. It's part of what we do. And all of us will have encountered situations in our lives where we have chosen to do that. I think the circumstances here where you've got such a large collective of people doing that is very unusual. And that's why this thing has taken over 20 years to unravel. But it's not unique to this business. It's just that this is a particularly bad case where that human behavior, which is a natural human behavior, had no checks and balances in the way that Ruth was suggesting with, quarterly reports or whatever means. So there were no checks and balances to root it out and challenge it.
Yeah. Prav, you think something just now, and then after that, Juliet.
Yes, I was just going to say that perhaps it may not be the lack of values which actually meant the power come through, but actually excessive power, which actually took over. It's saying more or less the same thing, but power was far in excess of what it should have been in order to allow truth to persist.
Yeah. Juliet and then David.
Yeah, I'd throw in two things, and boarding out a bit from the post office as well. I think one is fear. We talked about it before, personal fear, whether it's hang on to your job or your pension or whatever it is. The second thing is actually, I think that it's the organisation values being wrong. So if you look at whether we're correct or not, but we said Fujitsu, reputation, technical credibility, profit, they'd be saying to their employees, these are great values to have. Whereas if you look at the values that the postmasters had, you came up with very different words: trust, integrity, justice, loyalty. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if our corporations had those as values?
Yeah. David.
Yeah, building on that, love that. And what I was going to say, and I like the comment, willful blindness. I've never heard that before, but I really like it. Linked to willful blindness, I think one of the things that, and coming back to pressures, which was the question, one of the pressures I find in companies is good news reporting. So things do get reported, not quarterly reports, but it's good news reporting. Do not report any bad news. They don't want to hear the bad news, just report good news. Now, that contradicts all those values. So if you look at the values that perhaps weren't there, trust, honest, respect, they were in the Sub-postmasters review. When we looked at the others, they didn't seem to be there heavily. So it's interesting, and hence I support what Julie said. But again, any company, be clear, if they are not focused and got strong values, you get this good news reporting up. But likewise, you do not get exposing of problems. Now, world-class problems expose problems to fix them. And any company that isn't doing that in the future, at some point in the future, will crash and burn.
Exactly.
Now, how they will crash and burn, we don't know. The post offices was a particularly catastrophic one. But any company that's not doing that and isn't founded on their strong values that come from the top, and they expose problems so they can fix them, that's part of their culture. And I refer to Toyota's culture in that. Absolutely is, from the chairman down. And the worst situation is to have when people don't report they've got problems, because as Toyota would say, that's the worst of all problems, because we've got people who don't even know what the problems are, and everybody's got problems. So we've got the worst possible of all problems because our people don't know what our problems are. So that's a wholly different culture that exposes problems to fix them. And any company that isn't doing that at some point will crash and burn.
Yeah.
And
the term willful blindness, by the way, comes from this brilliant book.
Oh, okay.
By Margaret Heffernan, which I'm sure, David, you would really enjoy.
Yes, thank you.
Called Willful Blindness, Margaret Heffernan. It's a superb book. Really good.
I'll put the link in the chat, David, so you can just access it from there. So, right, the final question then. So, bearing in mind everything that we've talked about so far, and again, can I remind you that we're not talking about the post office specifically, we're thinking more generally. What measures need to be put in place to protect the organization's stated values when things go wrong.
Is that worded that way very deliberately? Because
Well,
that's
I doubt it.
Okay, because what measures need to be put in place to protect the organization when the values go wrong, or when
to protect the organization's stated values when things go wrong?
So you're trying to protect the values, but doesn't that depend on whether, stated values, okay.
Stated values.
So in other words, how do you protect the espoused values? Well, that shouldn't be your first, I guess your first thing should be, let's do a root cause analysis and find out why something went wrong. And then once we have a root cause analysis, the second thing would be, did our stated values in some way contribute to that going wrong? Or are our stated values not being lived in the organization because they're not used for decision making, etc. And are they the right values for the people that we have, and do we have the right people for the values that we have? So those would be some of my suggestions.
I mean, can I also add in there that actually to wait for things to go wrong is part of the problem. I question how many organizations write stated values but don't actually think, first of all, test how that will be applied in practice, nor think through scenarios in any great depth as to how they will cope with conflicts in values, because values are not just values, but they have to be prioritized under different contexts. And I think one big issue this has thrown up is that actually the concept of having stated values is not enough. There needs to be a really thorough process. It needs to be understood. Non-executive directors should really understand they have a responsibility to make sure that the culture of the organization has to be properly rooted in the work and the people. And that is not just writing a nice set of fluffy words to go in the annual report.
Well, in fact, if they do write a set of fluffy words, you might as well throw them out. You can't determine values in the C-suite. You need to do a proper values.
Right. Interestingly, Ruth, actually, I know we don't want to go back to the post office, but it's interesting that as far as I could find out, didn't have any stated values at all. I combed their website, combed everything.
I don't think they.
I think recently,
well, they would have had public service. Public
service
values.
At some point, but that was quite late in the day. They had no stated values. I think still don't actually, although they've now got
Charles, I think that was somewhere in the post.
Yes, very good.
I think the point about statement, I think is very valid, because again, if we look at world-class companies, it's how you deploy. So it's deployment, and executives are responsible for deployment. So deployment of the value systemically into how the business operates. So it's not having a stated piece of paper with some stated values on. That's meaningless. So it's actually deploying that, and how do you deploy it? And Japanese companies, your Toyotas, have very, very clear structured ways of deployment, of deploying their values into everything they do. So how do you do that? And it's not left to accident, it's built in systemically. And when there's problems, then they look at why are our values not systemically in operation here? And they'll do continuous improvement on that. And often it comes down to policy and policy deployment. They call it Hoshinkanri. But sort of the place, how do you deploy policy into practice? And if you've got values, those are part of your deployment. And that you need to make sure those are deployed and deployed well, to make sure your values are present in every decision you make, in every part of your business. So it's not left to accident, and it's certainly not left on a piece of paper, and it is an executive responsibility.
Except in the case of Fujiitsu, obviously. But.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and centrally, absolutely right, absolutely right. And they'll be challenged in Japan over that. There'll be huge issues in Japan related to that.
It's true.
I think one of the reasons that this still happens in organizations is because historically values has been the remit of either marketing or PR or HR.
That's right.
They are all support functions.
Right. Right.
So as a result, the values don't get into the guts of the business, which is where they need to be. They're just handled by these people on the side. And I'm not trying to be dismissive to HR or PR or marketing people, but it needs to be dealt with, like we've all been saying, in different ways, in a very operational, practiced way.
From the CEO.
So,
Emma is been trying to say something.
Yeah, I was just all really I agree completely with what you're saying. They've absolutely got to be lived, and I think that's probably why we're all even on this call. We all believe in that. But you asked for what measures could be put in place. I was just thinking of some practical things. Of course, Alan, they should read your book. There are lots of measures in your book.
My book.
I was also thinking that it's like stress testing some of these things, isn't it? It's actually that forward thinking. How would we run this HR process and live our values, rather than waiting to happen and try and do it, but actually saying, what does it look like when we have a tricky situation? What is this decision that we're going to make about who we're going to go into partnership with? What would that look like if we're really living our values? So I was just thinking that as a practical measure to really embed it in. And we have a client who used to put their values on the table in a physical representation, like they have a thing that represented the value. And at the beginning of every single meeting, that each value had to be taken responsibility for. And then you were the person in that meeting who was responsible for ensuring all the decisions lived the values, which I think is a very simple, clear way to do it. But 31 practices, it's got nice lots of ideas.
Simon's going to make the final comment on this question, and then we're going to hand over to Charles to draw things to a close.
No pressure. I was just going to say I worked for a Big Four professional services firm for some time, and there the risk area is the area that sort of checks that every engagement is supposed to be consistent with their values, and they'd have an annual process of sort of training session where they talk about projects where they went no to try and learn. And also if they said yes and then subsequently it was seen as not a good call. So that regular annual sort of check of the big
Hasn't
major
always worked for the Big Four though.
Right?
This is another book, by the way, Blind Spot. Yeah, if anybody's interested.
And I'm saying, not for a minute saying that the Big Four is that it works all the time, but it was certainly a process that worked reasonably well in the team I was part of.
Yeah. And then just one final comment is that what Emma, what you were talking about there, and also Simon, if you depersonalize the situation and instead of rely on an individual saying, I think we should do this, and you switch it to, well, what do we need to do that's in line with our values? It's just a whole lot easier. So great conversation. Sorry, it was a bit rushed. And now over to Charles to wrap up.
Okay, it's amazing how time passes by very fast when you're talking about values. I'm always amazed. I think we've got a long way in this discussion, and hopefully you've all going to be able to take something away from it. And really, all we wanted to do in this final round, we've got 5 minutes. So just very quickly, if everyone, if they want to, could maybe just give us their single takeaway. What's struck them, what's hit them, what has emerged, not necessarily what anyone said, but what they're taking away from this discussion. This most disastrous episode in our corporate history in the UK for a long time, although there are quite a few close rivals through time. But what do you take away from this conversation? And it can be anything, any part of that conversation, to do with the post office, to do with the postmasters, but just more generally our most recent discussion, our most recent conversation, the questions that we've just been exploring. Would anyone like to kick off and give us a takeaway before we go home? Any volunteers? Simon.
I
think sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, while I'm concerned that no individual's been held accountable for the terrible things that have happened, there is really a systemic issue. When you had the question asking what would you do in these situations, it's very difficult, particularly if your context, it means that you don't have freedom just to move on, to go to another job. So it does sort of highlight the importance of systems to allow people to live good values.
Shall we take John and then Juliet? In fact, John.
Yeah, I feel things should be brought down to a more basic level, more local level within within corporations or organizations. I think values in each of the organizations involved seem to have got away from them, and it created some sort of a perfect storm. That why all this happened. Because there's a phenomenon that will never really be truly answered as to what went wrong.
Yeah, so it's not so much the facts. Yeah.
So many different things went wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Juliet, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I've been very absorbed by this whole scenario even before the debates play, and just pondering that values had never been discussed as part of it. And I think this just shows that values is absolutely at the heart of it, but that there's a kind of disconnect. We've had to be sort of fetching around for what we think the values were of those organisations, and that clear disconnect between corporate values, whatever they are, and those individual values of the postmaster. And I think that's why it's made us all feel so angry or whatever, or baffled, because it's clearly wrong what's happened on so many fronts. So I think values is absolutely at the heart of it.
As you say, it's not featured in any of the discussion coverage that I've seen, really, although it's obviously come out quite strongly indirectly. Yeah.
Charles, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So Charles, you didn't want anybody to be provocative, but I'm going to be provocative in a different way, which is, I think, I'm not saying that this couldn't have happened in another country, because it certainly could have done. However, I think there are certain Anglo-Saxon cultural traits which made it far more likely to happen here than it would have done in France or Switzerland or in other places. And one of them is one that I've observed in the plus 40 years that I've lived here, which is people don't speak up. And that is something which, for the good of the country, for the good of companies, all of us in one way or the other, I think we're fighting it. And I think one has to continue to fight that fight, because people just, it's not my problem, I'm not going to say anything. Whereas if it were in Holland, everybody would have been screaming, France, it would have been on the streets burning tires, So I do think there's a certain, culture.
I think that's very, very, very true. I'm sure that's right. Emma?
That just led me very neatly, Ruth, into kind of pull out what I think. I think we have an over-dependence on rules. It's like we can, so we do. We can prosecute them, so we will. The rule says this, and we lose sight of the values and what we're all about, and we cling on to rules. And I think that is reflected in our organisations all the time now. We just go, oh, it's a rule, we can do it, follow a process, we'll be safe. And we lose the values, and this is what happens. And I think you're right, we are a society that thinks the rules will sort it out, our system, rule of law, all of these things will sort it out, and something went wrong. They don't know.
Thank you, Emma. David?
I fully agree with what's just been said. So again, that focus on values. The phrase that I'm taking away is this willful blindness. So thank you, everybody. This willful blindness by not focusing on values, and things that come to my mind is that we do need to focus on values. We do need to focus on purpose, which on purpose as well, clear purpose, and having good meaning, a clear purpose for the good of society, people, planet. So we do need that. The second thing that does come to mind that's linked to that is not to be distracted by mission. So we need to focus on values and purpose. We need to stop being distracted by mission, because actually, arguably, that is the willful blindness. We can't have that.
Yeah. That was it. Isn't it? Anyway, Dorian, Maggie, I was not how to say. Sorry, and Barbara.
I've got to go.
Yeah. Okay.
Should I go? Yeah.
Yeah, Maggie. Yeah.
I just want to say it's kind of spurred me on to think how I worked with values back in 2014. I think when I first came to know you around those times, and how I'd use them in an organisation. I am in HR, where you're looking at processes and policies, but I did at that time work in an organisation, always putting values in front of them in their processes and procedures. So your KPIs would have a value, a strong one, put in there. Every meeting, you'd have to have a value written onto the meeting note form, and what values why are we having this meeting? And I stopped doing it. And I'm about to go into another sort of large organisation, and that's really going to help me be not brave, but I don't know. It's a target to go for to actually bring that back in, which is not common, I think.
Right. Thank you, Maggie. Barbara, Crab.
Yeah,
Crab.
I just wanted to say one of the two things. Numeracy is not everybody's strength, and I think the postmasters, even though they may have been numerate, they were up against a software that can't be questioned in any way, and I think this is where the bullying of organizations got the better of it.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, I would just say to add, I mean, I think that the human dynamics at play here, that fascinates me, the psychology behind it. And I think that people in the decision maker roles, the senior executives of both organizations, they get to those positions and they have pride and they have power and they have ego. And then there's the greed aspect, which has been mentioned as well, and financial incentives. So I think that you cannot overlook those aspects and them being very tenacious to stand on their position and not back down, even though there was a huge quantity of people that were negatively affected by this. They just did not ask the questions by virtue of trying to protect their own ego or their own image.
Ego is the problem in most situations, isn't it? Really comes down to Dorian.
I would just, the quick viewpoint I would take is that I am horrified that if the post office scandal is allowed, all of the reviews of it dissipate away without actually the recognition that what has happened here is a crashing failure of values being maintained, considered, inbuilt. I mean, I consider this issue to be fundamentally one of values, and I think it affects not just the companies concerned. I think it affects all companies. I think it definitely affects also the legal system and the courts. This really should be a wake-up call that we have blindly and maybe willfully blindly allowed this scenario to develop, and it is. So I think your sort of focus on the values aspect of it has brought me to this meeting, because I think it is so important.
Thank you. I mean, it's basically what brought us to holding this meeting.
Go on.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, we've got it loud and clear from everyone, really. I think everyone's had their say now. I mean, the values here are crucial. Alan, you haven't had your say. You're right.
Yeah, just to build on what Emma said, actually, and I can't remember the name of the movie that I saw, but it was basically about somebody who had been convicted when they were innocent, and then trying to get justice. And in the final scene, the person defending the guy who had been sent down made the point that actually, whereas everybody was saying the law had let us down, he said that's not actually right. We've let the law down, because we have the right to interpret the law and apply it appropriately, and we have failed to do that. So it's Emma's point about how we're kind of not brave enough to do what's right. Instead, we just go along with the rules. So spirit rather than letter is where I go.
I heard to that. Neil, do you want a quick say, or shall we wrap up? I'm conscious that we're 5 minutes over time, and I know a couple of people already needed to go. Not that I want to put you on the spot.
I think I'm done. I've really enjoyed the session, John.
So thank you very much, everyone. I'll skip my takeaway, and we'll share the recording of this if you want afterwards, and some notes about it, because I think this is a desperately important subject, and I think there's some very powerful messages coming out from all of us and from our discussions and individually. So thank you all so much for taking part. We will write this up. We will hope to get in touch with you later. If you want to sort of join in and try and make some difference on this, those of you who are not a member of the UK Values Alliance, we'd welcome like-minded people who want to join us and do this work. I mean, not just talk about it, but really try and make some difference, really. So do join us. It's what is it? ukvaluesalliance.org.uk. You'll find a membership form there, or just reply to one of the emails that you've got, and we'd love to see you. So see you at one of our next meetings or somewhere else, I'm sure, and let's talk more about values and the difference we need to make. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.